Direi che possiamo cominciare. Buon pomeriggio a tutte e a tutti. Io sono Chiara Sigele, direttrice del Centro Cooperazione Internazionale. Sono molto felice di essere qui insieme ai copromotori di questo Estival, una seconda edizione. Avevamo fatto una prima edizione pilota a novembre 2023 e abbiamo voluto riportare a Trento questi 2 giorni per parlare di politica, società e cultura dell'Est Europa, convinti che siano temi che, anche se non sempre lo percepiamo, ci riguardano da vicino come cittadini europei. E alla mia sinistra c'è il professor Schiavo della Scuola di Studi Internazionali, che è il secondo copromotore di questo evento, e il terzo copromotore che voglio citare fin da subito è East Journal, che appunto alcuni anni fa ci ha proposto di portare a Trento questa idea, sostanzialmente con 2 obiettivi. Il primo era quello di creare uno spazio di confronto e di dialogo tra quanti in Italia si occupano con continuità, con competenza e con passione di questo spazio a est e anche per mettere in luce il fatto che proprio a Trento ci sono alcune di queste realtà italiane come OBCT, come appunto la Scuola di Studi Internazionali o anche East Journal, che cercano di raccontare e di aiutare l'opinione pubblica a comprendere le trasformazioni che sono in atto nei paesi. Se volessimo un po' semplificare questo spazio che chiamiamo Est Europa, che non è davvero un concetto geografico, ma è soprattutto un concetto che ricorda che per molti decenni il nostro continente è stato diviso, ma che appunto in realtà ci parla di una regione che copre anche tutti i Balcani, compresa la Grecia, che non era sicuramente uno stato post-comunista, e arriva fino alla Turchia e al Caucaso. Ci tengo, prima di dare la parola al professor Schiavo, a portare anche il saluto della dottoressa Nicoletta Clauser, della UMST Pianificazione Europa PNRR, che è tra i soggetti che hanno sostenuto anche finanziariamente questo evento. Purtroppo un impegno istituzionale all'ultimo le ha impedito di essere qui, ma porta il suo saluto. Quest'anno appunto Estival non si tiene in novembre come nella prima edizione, ma a maggio, il 9 maggio, perché abbiamo proprio voluto creare una sinergia con il Festival Siamo Europa per sottolineare quanto capire e sentirci coinvolti in quello che riguarda appunto i nostri colleghi paesi membri dell'Unione Europea o i paesi candidati all'allargamento sia importante proprio per il presente e per il futuro dell'integrazione europea e non soltanto. E dicevo, prima di dare la parola al professor Schiavo, vorrei comunque ringraziare fin da subito i colleghi e le persone che sono state come dire molto coinvolte, che hanno reso possibile la realizzazione di questo evento. Ne cito alcune un po' per tutti, ma sicuramente voglio ricordare Roberta Bertoldi, Chiara Conte, Erion Giatolli, Rossella Vignola, che insieme insomma a tanti colleghi sia dell'università che di OBCT hanno speso tanto tempo per rendere la giornata di oggi e di domani possibile. Stefano, ti cedo volentieri la parola.
Grazie mille, grazie Chiara, grazie a tutte e a tutti voi per essere qui. Mi fa piacere vedere che ci sono tante persone e anche insomma in qualche modo non i soliti noti. E quindi un grande ringraziamento al Centro per la Cooperazione e all'Osservatorio Balcani Caucaso Transeuropa per averci coinvolto in questa iniziativa, che appunto è la sua seconda edizione. Farlo a maggio vuol dire anche che è più caldo e che non si creva di freddo questo, scusate, è un dettaglio per gli addetti ai lavori.
Al Centro per la Cooperazione Internazionale fa freddo d'inverno.
No, però è una bella iniziativa. Mi piace anche appunto anche ieri abbiamo avuto questo incontro diciamo, del Festival Siamo Europa in un formato un po' più pop del solito, e mi fa piacere che anche il programma di quest'anno di Estival rispecchia un pochino queste varie sfaccettature, quindi appuntamenti più accademici, più di taglio accademico, ma poi anche il film, le mostre, i dibattiti, proprio per parlare di questo tema in maniera diciamo a 360 gradi, e anche un modo per l'università per un pochino uscire dalle nostre stanze e per metterci un pochino in dialogo con la cittadinanza e con tutti quelli che si occupano di temi che sono in qualche modo rilevanti per quelli di cui ci occupiamo, alla scuola ma anche in altri dipartimenti dell'Ateneo. Mi piace che oggi appunto siamo fisicamente alla facoltà di giurisprudenza, vedo che ci sono anche colleghi di altre strutture ed è importante che appunto poi ci sia un dialogo al nostro interno e anche con il resto della città. Quindi di nuovo un ringraziamento a Chiara e a Luisa e al resto della squadra, e per quanto riguarda la scuola in particolare ai colleghi Jens Wölk e Alessandra Russo, che sono insomma il promotore e la promotrice di questa bella iniziativa. Però siccome nessuno di voi è venuto a sentire me, per fortuna io la chiudo qui. Vi ringrazio ancora e vi auguro un buon Estival a tutti, e un buon pomeriggio e buona continuazione, insomma, intanto. E mi metto là per sentire meglio, non scappo.
Grazie mille intanto. Io chiamo sul palco il professor Schmitter, con il quale inizieremo invece i nostri panel. Vi informo che il primo e il keynote speech e il primo panel saranno in inglese con traduzione simultanea se ne avete bisogno, e altrimenti dal panel successivo in avanti c'è invece sarà tutto invece sempre in italiano. Sono molto onorata naturalmente di introdurre il carissimo professor Philippe Schmitter, dal quale ho imparato tanto ai tempi in cui ero sua studentessa di dottorato, ormai un quarto di secolo fa purtroppo, e che nel 2015 ha donato a Osservatorio Balcani Caucaso Transeuropa un'ampia messe di materiali che costituiscono il fondo Schmitter che abbiamo nella nostra sede di Vico San Marco, dove domani proseguiremo gli eventi. Sono circa 500 tra libri, pubblicazioni, articoli che riguardano la transizione postcomunista in Europa. Il professor Schmitter è docente emerito di scienze politiche all'Istituto Universitario Europeo e con la sua Lectio vorremmo iniziare il nostro festival cercando di capire cosa succede nel nostro spazio politico, nell'UE a 27, un'Unione Europea che quindi ha accolto buona parte dell'Europa centrale, orientale e balcanica dopo il crollo dei regimi comunisti, non solo come sappiamo, ma che è ancora un po' alle prese con il tema dell'allargamento, perché 9 sono ancora i paesi ai quali abbiamo promesso l'integrazione. E ci siamo chiesti con questo titolo che cosa non ha funzionato, cosa è andato storto più precisamente, ci siamo chiesti perché in fondo nel discorso pubblico, almeno in Italia, ci sentiamo più deboli anziché più forti oggi che siamo in tanti, perché spesso la percezione dell'Europa orientale è quella di paesi che costituiscono un problema. Recentemente li ho sentiti definiti come quelli che pensano che l'Unione Europea sia un bancomat, una sorta di cavallo di Troia a volte sono pensati, come paesi che in qualche modo ci indeboliscono. E quindi anche pensando alle elezioni, al primo turno delle elezioni presidenziali in Romania, da cui partiremo, di cui parleremo domani alla nostra sede, domani mattina, con un panel dedicato, lascio quindi la parola a Philippe Schmitter per dirci che cosa è andato storto con l'Europa.
Grazie. Sta bene? Sì. Farei il mio intervento in inglese, mi scusi, ma se vuole fare delle eventuali domande lo può fare in italiano. I'm very honored to have been invited to this occasion, although I confess that I'm a bit confused because I do not consider myself an expert in this part of the world, either Central Eastern Europe or the Balkans. But I will speak then as an outsider, as someone who observes this. What little I know about it, I know from my students at the European University Institute, and among which Luisa. So I have two themes that I want to develop. One is, of course, the problems of democracy in Eastern Europe and the Balkans are, of course, not just exclusive to that part of the world. Democracy in general is in trouble, or what I have called in my writings real existing democracy. Because what we have is not really democracy, certainly not in terms of the etymology of the term democrazia, people rule. It's ruled by politicians, some of whom have been chosen in a competitive way by citizens, many of whom have been appointed by those who were elected, and some are just simply, as experts, etc., professionally governing various kinds of agencies, etc. So real existing democracy it's important to recognize, is in trouble, not just in this part of the world, but or I should say, Central and Balkanic Europe, but elsewhere, including here in Italy. Now, I want to stress that what we have, what I have called real existing democracy, the normal expression for this, or the more correct normal expression, is liberal democracy. And what I think the way we should begin understanding the problems that it currently faces is to focus specifically on liberalism and on the liberal modifications that that ideology brought to democracy. The most important, of course, and the most disputable or in difficulty is representation. The idea that citizens do not participate directly, they participate indirectly through some sort of process of competitive elections, eventually, of course, between political parties that represent them. And it's clearly the institution of representation that is most contested and difficult to reconstruct at the present moment. So Eastern Europe, of course, comes at a particular moment in time where this is a problem, even more, of course, for Eastern Europe, where representation starts ex novo, so to speak, given the collapse of the Soviet Union and the absence of competitive political parties prior to that. Now, what is liberalism? I said, first and foremost, it's representation, and that's the core, I think, of the present difficulties. Secondly is the notion of checks and balances, specifically, of course, checks and balances institutionalized to limit the power of executives. And that is another obvious problem at the present moment. The rule of law, and even more broadly speaking, that of constitutions, in which it is presumed that politicians and citizens will conform to various kinds of commands or rules which have been set down previously and which are somehow respected and as legitimate. This is again in question. And then finally, there is the underlying social contract that all democracies have liberal democracies have depended on, and which is, again, not often openly expressed, but which is absolutely crucial to its survival. That social contract implied that the state, the political system, would compensate for what was, of course, the most important surrounding characteristic, which is capitalism. So the assumption was that this institution would regulate and redistribute a certain degree of income from those who were privileged by and who became increasingly privileged. And this, you don't have to be a Marxist to recognize that capitalism has a tendency toward concentration, monopoly, etc. So there is an intrinsic problem with that form of economy, and it was presumed that a democratic, liberal democratic state would, through taxation and regulation, would redistribute or control the extent of this concentration and redistributes it in favor of those who do not have own or private property or even professional titles. So that was the underlying social contract, so to speak. The problem with that is, of course, contemporary capitalism is no longer industrial capitalism, it's finance capitalism. And finance capitalism is vastly more difficult to redistribute, so to speak, simply because of the increased importance of electronic technologies of various sorts, which make it very difficult to even ascertain who owns assets, much less what is actually passing from one source to another. It also means, of course, you don't have the famous proletariat or large numbers of employed workers that can be, so to speak, organized and put pressure for such a redistributive effect. So basically then, what liberalism did was adjust the concept of democracy to two major changes in the environment. The first, of course, was the creation of larger and larger national states. Nobody, for hundreds of years, believed that democracy was an appropriate form of government for anything other than a Greek city-states, maybe a little bit Italian city-states, mountainous Swiss cantons, and an island in the middle of the Atlantic called Iceland. Other than that, it was impossible. So what liberalism did was to adjust it to a larger scale of government, and that meant the larger and larger national states. And to adjust it, as I mentioned just a minute ago, to industrial capitalism through the forms of various associability, freedom of association, trade unions, professional associations, etc., which encouraged this process of implementing the implicit social contract. Now, that's my diagnosis of the problem in general, not specific to this part of the world, but in general, and this part of the world, of course, coming into this process at the time it did, makes it even more, in a sense, dramatic than in those who have already got some kind of institutional basis for dealing with these problems. But just a footnote, once you have this diagnosis, it's very clear where you have to look for the solution. It's not anti-liberalism or post-liberalism. I call it alter-liberalism. We need to reinvent liberalism in order to recuperate these important things, to make it adjustable then to the two present transformations, namely globalization, even larger units of government or authority, and of course, which of course the EU is one, and also the change in the very nature of capitalism itself, so that the primary source of accumulation is now finance and not industry, at least for Western and all of Europe and North America and even Latin America for that matter. So that's my first point, and that's a generic problem that these countries have to deal with, and have to deal with it in more difficult conditions simply because of the timing. I want to say something about the timing too, just as a footnote again. I read somewhere, I don't know if this is true or not. I think it is. It's wonderful. If it's not true, it should be. Right? In the conversation that Khrushchev had with Reagan in Reykjavik, I'm told, Khrushchev said to Reagan, "I am going to really harm you. I'm going to deprive you of your enemy." It's very important because up to that point, a good deal of the legitimation of liberal democracy was simply based on its comparison with state communism, Soviet-type regimes. The collapse of the Soviet Union took away, so to speak, that convenient. Now, it's true that conservatives in the United States and elsewhere have tried to make Arabs and various other kinds of people into somehow a functional equivalent of the Soviet Union, but it hasn't worked really because they're not the same kind of threat and there's not the same kind of contrast, so to speak. But a good deal, then, as I say, of the legitimation of liberal democracy was simply, it was a lot better for the welfare of those living in it than the alternative or the threat that was posed by state communism and even more specifically by the Soviet Union and its satellites. So that's the first observation. Now, to talk a little bit more about certain specificities of your Eastern Europe, because obviously in addition to this general context, which it, so to speak, inherited from the West, it has specificity. The most important, of course, is something which, with one exception that I happen to be particularly fond of, I'll say something about that in a minute. This is not a single transition from autocracy to democracy. It is a dual transition, of course, from state socialism to private capitalism, so to speak. So that the duality of the transitions, almost all of the other countries that move from autocracy to democracy barely changed the rules of property or other forms of economic. The only one is the one I'm most proud of, I have to say, because I was a participant observer, and that, of course, and it's the most successful case, incidentally, of all the democracies, is Portugal. Portugal was a genuine revolution, and there were major changes in state ownership and control over enterprises, particularly banks and insurance companies, major changes in land tenure, etc., major changes throughout the entire society. No other transition to democracy in Western Europe or Southern Europe or Latin America went through such a dramatic change in its basic rules, so to speak, both of the economy and society. So Portugal is a shining example, which has not been, unfortunately, not been imitated by anybody else. And it was a rather peculiar situation, as I was a participant observer of the Portuguese Revolution. And I have to say very proudly is that there's a club in Lisbon of revolutionaries, and I am one of two foreigners who are members of that club. So I am a revolutionary, and I was delighted to be so. Nevertheless, elsewhere, it was a single political transition in the rules of the political game and the nature and the persons involved in ruling. Whereas in Eastern Europe, of course, it was a dual transition, and of course that meant an incredibly dangerous temptation to use the change in power to also use it to make a change in property and eventual wealth. So the intrinsic shall we say, propensity for corruption, and obviously it differed from one country to another, but nevertheless it was an omnipresent feature of the transition that there would be a kind of basic insecurity and in maldistribution of property as the result of this unusual transition, and therefore a kind of intrinsic danger of corruption from the economy or from the polity to the economy and back and forth. Now, given that, my conclusion is that things aren't really that bad in Eastern Europe. I think we often exaggerate, and I'm rather surprised that things aren't really as it could have been a lot worse, at least from my scenario, so to speak. And I've asked myself why. And I think there are two features of this transition that we need to pay attention to. One of which is a co-sponsor of this meeting, I gather. That is to say, membership in the European Union. There's no question that, but there is a fatal flaw or I won't say fatal, but a dangerous flaw in this process of conforming to the rules established by this supranational regional organization, the European Union. And that is that while each member country goes through an excruciatingly difficult, and I've supervised I don't know how many dissertations by students on the membership and what you had to do in order to become a member of the EU. I forgot how many capituli there were. Did you remember how many? Okay.
35, yeah.
Okay, she was, okay. The problem, of course, is that once you've done this, there's no subsequent control over your behavior. So once you become a member of the EU, it has proven to be, let's say, complicated. So I must say, you have to give credit to the Eurocrats. They have invented a few things that maybe cause some kind of reprisals or some exercise some degree of control over subsequent behavior. But nevertheless, there's no real official mechanism. I have been writing some papers about the EU. In one of the papers, I think that what the EU needs in the future is a mechanism not merely of self-exclusion, à la Bretagne, but expulsion. There should be a mechanism in which the EU members can expel member states for the behavior that they engage in. But there's none exist. There's simply withdrawal of funds and temporary restraint on voting, etc. But that's it. So membership in the EU, and for some countries anyway, membership in NATO has been an important positive, or made an important positive contribution, and therefore explains why the outcome is perhaps better than I think we might have expected. The second feature, of course, is more recently, and that's the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. That has dramatically changed a parameter which was presumed to be fixed at the beginning, namely some kind of, I won't say à la Kant, perpetual peace, but nevertheless a permanent security community, so to speak, in which at least, if nothing else, the member countries, or even those who didn't become members, were at least assured of some kind of degree of sovereignty or, let's say, control over their own space. Russia has dramatically demonstrated that this is not the case, and clearly could be not the case elsewhere. So the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has dramatically changed, and I think in this case probably the net effect will be positive in the sense that countries will not merely contribute more to their own defense, but they will also be more attentive to the rules of the game, rule of law, constitutions, etc., than they might have been otherwise. And then finally, possibly, there's Trump. The withdrawal of the United States, or the actual hostility of the United States to many of the accomplishments. Trump seems to define the EU as an exploitive organization designed explicitly to exploit the United States. I don't know quite how he arrives at that conclusion, but he seems to believe this. And this, in fact, is, for Europe, a good thing. You got a new enemy. You not only have a revived Russia, but you then have a hostile power. Now, my hope, of course, is that Trump is very temporary and that he will shortly, once the new elections, the interim and then the eventual presidential elections, all of that will be dismissed. So I'm assuming, optimistically, that this is only a temporary phenomenon. But nevertheless, there's no question that it has reinforced a sense of collectiveness and willingness to both feel but even obey European rules. So my conclusion is that I'm not very pessimistic. I think that Eastern Europe has not been doing as badly as it might have, and that in fact it will probably improve in the future underneath or in response to these new challenges that are coming from Russia and the United States. It's true that many of these governments are... Guillermo and I, when we wrote a book about transitions, we invented, we revived and invented a concept. The first concept we stole from the Spaniards, dicta blanda, soft dictatorships. And the other one I invented, democradura. That is to say, hybrid regimes which were democratic in some aspect, but not, quote, really democratic in the liberal sense of the term. So clearly, many of these Eastern European countries, but also elsewhere in Latin America and Asia, etc., we have a bunch of dicta blandas and democraduras, or hybrid regimes, which do not fit the criteria, but are nevertheless somehow imitating it to some degree. And so I've asked myself, first, there is this hope, which I mentioned, and that is that liberal democracy has repeatedly demonstrated historically that it has self-corrective mechanisms. And probably the most important, this of course, is continuous elections. That is one thing we continue to see, even in democraduras or dicta blandas, that they still hold elections. They may rig them or change the rules in such a way that, Orban can't possibly lose, but he still holds elections. And therefore, that mechanism is still there and could conceivably then change the outcomes. So democracy has certain, and of course the rule of law and their professionalization of the legal, of lawyers and of judges, etc., is another aspect of self-correction. So we have reason to hope that this dicta blandas and democraduras will eventually conform more closely to what I hope will be a reinvented liberal democracy. I thank you for your attention.
I have to say, Philip, that it's clear that you're American and I am European, meaning that you're an American and I am a European, meaning that your optimism is really something that in this room I think is not very widespread.
Okay.
So, which is good, you know.
That may be my residual Americanness. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I hope your contagion of optimism will allow us also to respond better to the current situation. I might want, maybe from the room there are immediately questions, and I would start from you. Otherwise, of course, I have my own observations. If anyone has, and then we have a microphone. Can I see hands raised? Sì, domande, chiedo scusa, adesso mi sono confusa. Se qualcuno ha delle domande da fare, a parte Jens Wölk.
Si può farlo in italiano se vuole.
Grazie, anche grazie dell'ottimismo. Now I change to English. My question is social media. You didn't mention this. Is this something which is an important issue for also the resilience of the liberal democratic model? So is it also needed a self-correcting mechanism for coping with social media? And the other point regarding this nice anecdote with Gorbachev and Reagan and the losing the enemy, do we need an enemy in the sense, does liberal democracy, does any system need an alternative model? And maybe one problem is that we do not have a real alternative model to capitalism, also in the economic field. So what's politics about when it's all about making money, being efficient, and these are the main principles? Everything else has to be subordinate to. And the third point is the question which you mentioned as the self-correcting mechanism, is the question of elections. And I think there is a real problem now that we cannot, in many countries, we cannot trust the electoral process anymore. Look at Georgia. I don't want to quote Belarus and Russia, but even countries like Georgia, where there has been a regime change. And if we do have a problem here, I think then also this self-correction is in danger. Thank you.
Would you like to respond one by one? Or
Sure, I can do so. Unless there's somebody who would like to join.
2 more questions if you want. Otherwise, you can...
No, let me concentrate, because these are big questions.
Okay.
Okay. I didn't talk about social media, you're right. And it is an important... There is has come about this radical change in the very technology of politics, let's call it. And you can call it social media if you wish. It means essentially that there are multiple sources of information, and that at least without, shall we say, Chinese levels of coercion, state coercion, you can't control this. And I don't know, I really do not understand whether that can be a self-corrective mechanism eventually. Remember that initially there was a great deal of optimism. Among others, Jürgen Habermas, who welcomed this whole idea that now all of a sudden every citizen could express him or herself to anybody else, and that was a kind of going to be a ultra-democratization of the communications process. And then all of a sudden we discovered that this had all sorts of negative implications. So I can't tell you. I just say it is a very good question, and it certainly is an important part. Again, it's one of these generic things. It's not specific. I don't think that, this woman, wait a minute, we just had a conference at the Badia on Serbia, and she was the head of a kind of the media, whatever, and it turns out that in Serbia there is significant control over it. So it is possible in a democratura, or a dicta blanda in this case, to control access to it. And I don't know how long, however, and whether or not, because the technology is continuously changing and there are continuously challenges, so to speak, to this process of repression in the media and distortion, of course. Again, if you look at what is one of the most important things of this changing historical process, namely the formation of larger and larger national states, national identities, French, Spanish initially, and then, oh my God, even Italian. There was no Italy in 1860. You had, what was it, famous one? D'Annunzio? D'Azeglio, that's it, yeah. Abbiamo fatto l'Italia, basta fare gli italiani, or whatever it is. Okay, but you made Italians in part by war, or by the threat of the outside. So this business of needing an enemy, not merely to justify your own political system, but the very unit within which you're exercising. So what does it mean to be in this Kantian world of perpetual peace? And whether or not the implications of that is that state boundaries and the strength of national identities will erode, and you will then have these new identities based on who knows what, right? So again, but historically at least, we know that having an enemy makes an important contribution to even the basic political identity of people, much less to their willingness to obey, regard as legitimate a particular set or particular regime. The electoral process. I don't know. I think I may be the only American political scientist anyway, who has never studied elections. I'm very proud of the fact that I've never studied political parties' elections. I'm interested in interest groups, social movements, and at least I had been when I worked on Brazil and other places. So I don't feel competent to address that question. But I would remind you that there have been a number of instances in which the manipulation of elections was so egregious that there was a popular reaction. I think that's happened several times, especially in Central Asia, but elsewhere. So you've had these green, yellow, whatever they're called, revolutions. Usually the trigger of those was some kind of egregious manipulation of electoral results, and you got a popular uprising, and you, in some cases at least, got rid of the government that did that. So that is a corrective mechanism. I just don't know how efficient it is and how much you can manipulate districts and manipulate candidacies and put opponents in jail and the usual list of distortions, how much you can do before you hit that, you go over that threshold and you create a reaction. But that has happened, and we can hope that it will happen again.
We have a second and a third question. Francesca Vanoni, please.
Hi. Good afternoon, and thank you for your opening. My head is a bit spinning now, so I may go all over the place. I hope I make my question clear. How about if democracy, regardless of what part of Europe or the, let's say, Western world, is unable because unequipped to deal with the current trends? And I'm referring to, I don't know, what AfD is doing in Germany, how it is growing, and we are all debating about the fact that it cannot be shut down because that would not be democratic. Or what is going on in Palestine, where one of our allies is doing tragedies, not to call it anything else. And they are our allies. Therefore, since we are the democratic world, we cannot really impose our alternatives. And regarding that, not having anymore the competitor, the useful competitor, you called it in a very interesting way.
I didn't say competitor, I said enemy.
Well, initially you used the softer term.
Competitor is
like
one thing.
Okay.
Is China a competitor or an enemy? Okay.
Correct. I take your stronger word. What happened to our capacity of upholding human rights, democracy, and the so-called liberal Western values in our relationship with China, for example? We are not anymore able to call that an enemy because they are representing the opposite of what we are upholding, which is pluralism and individual liberties and intermediary groups and stuff like that. And so the end of my question is, maybe we should rediscuss whether democracy is the right system for the current dynamics. And I wouldn't know where to start, but maybe you do with your optimism. That I envy you deeply.
Okay, I think it's probably better. You want to?
No, please.
Oh, sorry, I spoke.
No. But these are important questions, so maybe I'll forget if I don't answer right away. That's now. Okay, you said what was the first one about threat?
Being equipped. Being equipped.
Whether democracy
is equipped. Can
deal with this.
Well, I mean, it has been able to do so in the past. You're right. The technology is changing or changed. And, of course, my optimistic version is that if we would come up with a revised notion of liberal democracy, one which in particular would be much more, it would engage much more citizens in governing, then my hope would be it would be better equipped to respond. But again, everything depends on the nature of that. And that's why I think bringing up China is an important point, because clearly, certainly the United States, is trying to make China into a new Russia, so to speak, or whatever. Now, I have to say I have a kind of unusual position here because for a number of years I taught in China, in Shanghai, at Fudan University. And so I know the Chinese better than most people. And I'm actually quite optimistic. I don't think, it's true they have an increasingly repressive government, but they also have an increasingly aware. And most people are not aware of this, but there are local elections and even some competitive elections at the village, small unit, not large cities, but in smaller units. And, and if you, I have to say, Chinese become very good at knowing what they can say, where, and to whom. So it's one thing what they tell you in your office. It's another thing in your seminar. It's another thing on the streets or to officials. But there clearly is a very important transformation taking place among younger people in China, right? And so I'm not at all convinced that this government will be able to reproduce the level of repression that it has attained for a much longer period of time. So I'm not pessimistic about the ability for the Chinese to be, and of course, as enemies, they are a rather different kind of enemy, especially, of course, at least if you take Trump for his word, a commercial enemy who simply produces things better than you do, and even technology and inventions of new technology. So, as I say, I'm not convinced on that score. Now, values, I have no idea. But I will tell you one thing. One of the most important pieces of information which I have gathered, but particularly, in fact, specifically about Italy, but I've gathered it from some other places as well. And you have to understand, I'm not exactly a great fan or proponent of survey research, public opinion research. I've never done it. I don't trust it. But still, here's a piece of information from Italy. If you asked Italians I think the survey I saw was in the late 1960s, and you ask young Italians between 18 and 25 at that time if they knew who their parents voted for, something like 85% of Italians knew who their parents voted for. So party and party identification was being trained. Didn't mean necessarily you'd vote the same way, but you knew who it was. You had a sense and were given a sense of representation and party identification through family. Right. I don't know the data for other countries. I think Greece was the only country higher than Italy, but other than that, it still was high. Today, the one I saw was 23%. So this tells you something about this value. So something is happening inside the family. Now, this is specifically with regard to party identification and voting behavior, etc. Maybe that's gone down more than, say, other values. But there's clearly something changing in between generations, and this intergenerational transmission of identities, values. I don't know what that means, to tell the truth, right? But that is an important internal and often unrecognized component of change within Western democracies.
We have one last question before we close. Simona Piattoni.
Sì. Philippe, you said you defined liberal democracy as representation plus the rule of law, checks and balances, and the social contract. Now, and with representation, you meant basically elections. Now, elections...
Well, no, but also freedom of association, and that's what I was interested in. But
sure.
Most people think of it, and that's the public spectacle.
Sure.
The private spectacle.
And all that it...
yeah, okay.
That it takes, yeah. in many ways, I mean, elections and all that it takes are a necessary condition for liberal democracy, but not a sufficient one. Without the rest, the other elements, you wouldn't have.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what happened, I want to go back to Europe. What happened in Europe by many was identified as a sort of a split. Instead of having liberal democracy, you have either illiberal democracy, think of Orban, or undemocratic liberalism. And by that I mean, lots of individual rights, particularly economic rights. You have a big market that gives you more rights than you had even in the first post-war period. You can buy more stuff, travel more, whatever.
And you can hide it more easily.
And you can hide it more and invest it in, okay. So, but, the other components are very important. So, if in Europe you start to inject the virus, if you want, of illiberalism, and you start to take away the real meaning of not only of elections, but also of what elections normally protect, that is the rule of law, the checks and balances, then this contagion could spread. And Europe is very much, the European Union now, I mean, not just Europe as a geographical continent, but the European Union is very much founded on law and the rule of law.
Yes.
And so if it begins to be okay that you can defy, EU law and behave in an illiberal way of thwart, the independence of the judiciary, etc., then other countries might be tempted. And we see sort of a domino effect, don't we? I mean, within Europe, going, more and more towards the right, and the right taking away those other defenses that are fundamental for democracy. So, are you not at least a little bit pessimistic about the contagion from within?
Yeah. Wow, okay. Elections are certainly necessary, but not sufficient for. And of course, elections can be conducted in many different ways. Not only the rules of selection, first past the post, proportional, etc., but also increasingly, what are the constituencies within which people are elected? And that's something the Americans know a lot about. It's rigging, manipulating those in order for especially minority parties, i.e. the Republican Party, to win by redistricting, the famous, okay. Now, but there are two features of elections that make liberalism work and why liberalism is so dependent. But it makes two assumptions, and this is what we should be concentrating our attention on, it seems to me. And this is exactly what's going wrong. And I'll give you the two. The two is we assume that the distribution of most of the issues in an election is normal, that is U-shaped, right? And we assume that the issues involved are not cumulative. They cut across each other, right? Now, obviously, if you have a bimodal and there's nobody in the middle and they don't cross, then you really cannot conduct an election successfully because the elections don't give you any information at all. They just simply tell you that there are these extremes and there's nobody, because all of the liberal conception of elections depends on the centripetal competition of parties for the people in the middle, so to speak. And if there's nobody in the middle, or those in the middle are a very small minority, then the elections produce very, shall we say, perverse outcomes as far as the notion of the possibility of rotation and power, for example, which is the key feature. Even if it doesn't happen, it should be able to happen, and therefore it affects the behavior of those who are in power. I can't tell you that. There are certain indications. Again, I say I'm very, very suspicious about survey research, but it does, there is evidence, certainly in the United States, of this polarization and that less and less people are in the middle. And there is considerable evidence all over the place of cumulative differences. The one that I like to stress, and I think is perhaps the crucial one, is one that Steinrock paid a lot of it. It's called center and periphery, right? So essentially what Trump is a mobilization of the periphery against the center. And I think that's also true of Orban. And so if you look at the voting data in those countries, you'll see that the vote for the repressive or illiberal form of manipulation of offices is coming from small towns and the periphery, and it's the national cap, it's Budapest against the rest of Hungary, among other things, right? So what does that mean? I'm not sure, but that's it. That key mechanism is not functioning the way a normal liberal model. Now, if you had another way of conducting elections or a different notion of constituencies, I mean, there's a number of things that you could think about that might improve that, but whether they would be adopted and by whom and under what kind of coalition, I really don't know. Then there's this question, you're absolutely correct, the EU depends more than any other political system, I think, ever invented on law, right? It doesn't have an army. It can't call out the troops. It has a Europol, but police, or Europol, I think it's called, yeah. But I mean, that's just a bunch of bureaucrats in Paris, I think. So it doesn't even have a police force. So it can't, so it's essentially dependent on this. But note that, yes, there are a number of nation states, especially newer member states, which have been gotten pretty good at ignoring the EU rules of the game. But still, I mean, I'm impressed by how clever the Eurocrats have become at creating mechanisms not quite based on treaty, but on other things, like withholding funds and voting rights for temporary periods, etc. So, we can hope that the EU. And now, of course, all of a sudden, on the horizon is a European army. Maybe even a European police force. Real one, right? Now, that's ridiculous. I mean, we're not there yet, but still, it seems to me that the direction of change is in beginning to make the EU into something that more closely resembles a state, rather than simply a federation or confederation of states, but having actually state-like properties, which would mean some kind of coercive capacity of its own. Now, that's a long way away, so that's just, again, you have to be wildly optimistic to believe that, but there are signs that, again, this is why Trump and Putin are useful in this sense, that it does make Europeans think more seriously about what it would be or what is needed to provide elementary security of boundaries and rules of the game. So, now.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I would conclude with the optimism around the army, common army, but for sure I would be happier to imagine better ways of dealing with unanimity votes first. But let's say, in general, let's say your optimism is for sure an encouragement to try to imagine our future in a better way. So thank you, Philippe Schmitter.
Okay, thank you.